Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Sunday everybody. As promised, here is today's make-up video for China Update, so that we're on top of the most up-to-date analysis as we move into next week. My apologies for interrupting your day of rest. This week, South Korean President Yoon sparked, perhaps intentionally, a diplomatic incident between his government and Beijing when he took a rare, firm Korean position on Taiwan, telling a journalist this week that the, quote, Taiwan issue is not simply an issue between China and Taiwan, but, like the issue of North Korea, it is a global issue, end quote. Adding that tensions around Taiwan were due to attempts from Beijing to change the status quo by force. The comments were made on the eve of Yoon's visit to the US, which is set to begin tomorrow, Monday, where he will meet with US President Joe Biden, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and other civilian and military leadership. Last year, Yoon criticized China's post-Pelosi trip military activities in the Taiwan Strait. Of course, Beijing, which has punished Seoul in the past with economic sanctions, was not pleased with the comments. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin expressed the same day that the Korean Peninsula issue and the Taiwan issue were, quote, completely different and not comparable at all, and this is a well-known fact, end quote, adding that Taiwan is, quote, an inseparable part of China's territory and purely an internal affair, end quote. State media, as it so often does when discussing the actions of a US ally, has framed Seoul as a American stooge, a foolish provocateur in the face of a calm, restrained and ever upstanding China. State-run Xinhua published a piece, for example, about, quote, domestic dissatisfaction over the government's humiliating diplomacy with the US, end quote. The theme was even more bluntly presented by the state-run Global Times. Quote, the US, by pulling together a small clique with South Korea and others of its allies, seeks to contain China in the fields of security and economy. Yoon's trip to the US may not yield a pragmatic outcome due to the unequal alliance. Biden's efforts to value relations with South Korea remain superficial. The South Korean government's diplomatic tilt towards the US has brought no good and only mounting criticism. The US, an ally of South Korea, is also prepared to sacrifice South Korea at any time for its own interests and will not hesitate to stab South Korea in the back when it needs to. End quote. Meanwhile, US media outlet Bloomberg and Japanese financial media outlet Nikkei Asia both report this week that South Korea is, quote, poised to extend its dominance over the global memory chip market at China's expense as US export controls shift the dynamics of semiconductor supply chains, end quote, in the words of the former. Also, in a note this week, Taiwan-based tech researcher TrendForce observes that South Korea's share of the worldwide output of DRAM chips will likely climb to 64% in 2023, with China's share dropping to 14% despite the last few years of growth. The prime cause for China's growth reversal is the US chip controls introduced in October last year, crippling, in the words of one commentator, China-based semiconductor production in several respects. Dynamic random access memory chips are critical components for data-intensive technology like AI and self-driving cars. Bloomberg writes that Korea's production of NAND flash chips, quote, is also poised to get a boost, though that may take longer than a year to arrive, end quote, adding that though it saw a surge last year, China's global share of NAND flash chips production is expected to peak at 31% in 2023 and then decline. After a recent rally, the market is starting to cool too. A gauge tracking China's chip-related firms dropped more than 5% on Friday, bringing 2023's advance to 15%. Though, as we can see, some of China's chip players still remain up. We will find out in the coming weeks whether the market sticks with the sector or seeks to diversify away from the geopolitical risk. In a separate piece, Bloomberg Intelligence argues, quote, even though Beijing is pouring money into the field, it could be another 5 to 10 years before China can manufacture advanced DRAM with its own equipment, end quote. Beijing has prioritized semiconductor manufacturing and, as such, will pour tremendous resources into greatly bringing this timetable forward. Indeed, just 2 days ago, on Friday, General Secretary Xi Jinping, at a meeting with senior officials, stressed the need for innovation for, quote, high-level technological self-reliance, end quote. Whether China is successful or not in these efforts, we will see. Next up, EU-China developments. Hey guys, if you enjoyed today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit that like button. It's just me making these episodes every day. It's a lot of work, but your guys' support is a huge source of motivation. Subscribing and sharing is a huge help as well, and for those who can go the extra mile and help me keep the channel financially sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. We've been following EU-China developments closely these last few weeks. The EU is currently engaged in a debate about what their China policy should be. Macron made his recent comments, which sparked some controversy in the West, and we have seen several high-profile visits to and statements about China from EU officials and leaders. Let's just move through the salient EU-China related updates from this week so that we are caught up. The arrest of a rights lawyer and his wife on the 13th of April, who had travelled to Beijing to meet with EU diplomats, has caused a minor diplomatic incident. The EU this week has demanded the, quote, immediate and unconditional, end quote, release of the two activists. Quote, I can't imagine the PRC diplomats are very happy about these arrests, which are seen by EU officials as a massive FU. It does make one wonder how much the security services and the foreign ministry coordinate, end quote. On Wednesday, Germany's foreign minister, speaking to the country's legislature, described parts of her recent trip to China as, quote, more than shocking, end quote, and said Beijing was increasingly becoming a systemic rival, more than a trade partner or a competitor. The same day, an internal report by the German Economy Ministry, leaked to media, indicates that Berlin may be rethinking China's Hamburg port deal. The report accuses the port operating company of failing to register the asset as critical infrastructure, thus changing the relevant regulatory components of the deal. For our purposes, we don't need to know the ins and outs of the deal. This incident merely indicates that there is renewed political pushback in Germany to Chinese purchases of German infrastructure. This week on Wednesday, the Netherlands Military Intelligence Agency accused Chinese companies of spying to, quote, acquire equipment and knowledge in the Dutch space sector, sometimes in circumvention of export restrictions, end quote. The same day, the Chinese embassy in the Netherlands expressed, quote, Chinese companies observe Dutch laws and regulations and contribute to the Dutch society. The accusations of Chinese companies spying are not based on evidence, not true, and not fair, end quote. This week, in a widely shared opinion piece, U.S. outlet The Wall Street Journal's chief economics commentator, Greg Ip, published a piece called Forget Macron, Europe and the US see eye to eye on China's threat, in which he argues, quote, in fact, the European Union has decisively changed its approach to China in the past year. Europeans use milder language than Americans, saying they wish to de-risk their economic relationship with China, not decouple. But, in substance, European de-risking and American decoupling look much the same. Indeed, Europe is erecting economic defenses against China that, in some cases, go further than the United States, end quote. This, of course, is just one man's opinion. I'd be interested to know what Europeans and others think in the comments below. Let's end with a Chinese state media commentary on the EU's China debate to get an idea of how Beijing's elite are discussing this and how they are presenting it to a domestic audience. We can see that its framing is quite different to the just covered Wall Street Journal opinion. Quote, the EU is now undergoing a period of adjustment to find equilibrium on its China policy. Some have fallen into the trap set by the US's democracy versus autocracy narrative, which puts China and Russia in one camp, and the claim of today Ukraine, tomorrow Taiwan still exerts influence on some European officials. However, the recent trips of European leaders, including von der Leyen and French President Emmanuel Macron, to China are helpful for marginalizing some extreme anti-China voices, especially after Macron's call for the EU to have strategic autonomy and his remarks on the Taiwan question. End quote. Is this an accurate characterization or wishful thinking? In the coming months, we will find out. Okay, that is today's special Sunday episode of China Update. Thank you everybody for watching. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday, and I will see you back for regular episodes tomorrow on Monday.